Alma Angeles and welcome to Eagle News International.
And I'm CJ Hero. Here are tonight's headlines.
The universal access to the coronavirus disease vaccine has been the centerpiece of President Duterte's intervention speech at the 2020 APEC Economic Leaders meeting, citing its role in the region's full recovery following the pandemic.
U.S. biotech giant Pfizer and German partner BioNTech seek approval to roll out their coronavirus vaccine early, a first step towards relief as surging infections prompt a return to shutdowns that traumatized nations and the global economy earlier this year.
A planned travel bubble between Hong Kong and Singapore was scrapped a day before its launch on Saturday after the southern Chinese city announced a sudden spike in coronavirus cases. And now to the news. President Duterte delivered his remarks in the Session 2 of the 27th Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Economic Leaders Meeting, or AELM, through virtual convention from Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. On November 20, the president underscored the importance of striking a balance between containing the spread of the coronavirus and being able to reopen economies as the Philippines continues to adjust to the new normal. The universal access to the vaccine has also been the centerpiece of the president's speech, citing its role in the region's full recovery following the pandemic. Let's listen in.
Global public good. Several modalities are available aside from bilateral and multilateral cooperation. Tripartite arrangements can be made between the government, private sector, and the multilateral financial institution. There is no other way. Let us resolve to act decisively on universal vaccine access and maximize these mechanisms. Second, information is the key to effective response and mitigation efforts. We welcome Malaysia's initiative to establish COVID Live online portal precisely for sharing of best practices. Finally, we need to keep trade free, open, and fair. This is key to achieving sustained and inclusive economic recovery.
Malaysian Prime Minister Muhyiddin Yassin said the annual Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Gathering held virtually this year due to COVID-19 pandemic focused on navigating global economies through the crisis. Watch this.
Of course, during the meeting, all the APEC leaders reaffirmed their concerns pertaining to the impact of COVID-19 on developing economies, with strong emphasis placed to protect people's well-being and at the same time keeping economic activities moving. Now, despite the challenges due to the pandemic, this has not deterred leaders from securing consensus of the participating economies to move beyond 2020. I think this is important. Strong focus on realizing the fundamental social economic goals that was first charted out in Bogor 26 years ago. APEC's work this year has been focusing on the importance of economic recovery post-COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, equally important is to accelerate work towards developing the COVID-19 vaccine and making it a global public good, and that is available, affordable to all, and that is multilateralizing the vaccine.
Of the key thrusts for this year's APEC, Mr. Muhyiddin outlined 3 areas that the grouping needed to focus on: support and commitment for the rules-based multilateral trading system, bolstering the digital economy, and inclusive economic growth. He also said closer cooperation between governments and respective private sector of each economy is important to drive growth and generate prosperity.
Hong Kong said the planned travel bubble with Singapore would be postponed for 2 weeks after a spike in coronavirus infections inside the southern Chinese city. In the light of recent surge of local cases, we have decided together with the Singapore government to defer the air travel bubble's launch by 2 weeks, according to Secretary Edward Yao. Hong Kong imposed new restrictions on Saturday, including the banning of clubs and party rooms, as well as prohibiting live performances and dancing in bars and pubs. The government announced earlier that primary schools will also be suspended for 2 weeks from Monday. The Hong Kong-Singapore air travel bubble agreement was supposed to start on November 22 with a single flight daily into each city, limited to a maximum of 200 passengers per flight. The number of flights will increase only if the spread of COVID-19 in both cities remains under control. Travel authorities from both sides have always said the deal will be suspended if the COVID-19 situation in either city deteriorates. Cathay Pacific was reported by local media to say that passengers can opt for a refund or reschedule their flights at no cost.
U.S. President-elect Joe Biden is nearing 80 million votes in the presidential election count, nearly 6 million more than President Trump. But Mr. Trump still shows no signs of conceding. Instead, he is pressing lower-level Republicans to try to overturn the results. In Wilmington, Delaware, a show of unity and talk of governing, as President-elect Joe Biden spent part of his 78th birthday meeting with House Speaker Pelosi and Democratic Senate Leader Chuck Schumer. Among their topics, coronavirus relief. At the White House, meanwhile, President Trump was in policy mood too, with his first public remarks in a week. Watch this.
Ever concerning vaccines, you wouldn't have a vaccine if it weren't for me for another 4 years, because FDA would have never been able to do what they did, what I forced them to do. And Pfizer and others even decided to not assess the results of their vaccine. In other words, not come out with a vaccine until just after the election. That's because of what I did with favored nations and these other elements. Big Pharma ran millions of dollars of negative advertisements against me during the campaign, which I won, by the way, but, you know, we'll find that out. Almost 74 million votes. We had Big Pharma against us. We had the media against us. We had big tech against us. We had a lot of dishonesty against us. These corrupt games will not deter us from doing what is right for the American people, and I will always put American patients first. And I think it can never be shown better than what I'm doing today. Already we successfully lowered drug prices for the first time in 51 years.
President Trump believes there was fraud in the election, as outside officials firmly affirms Mr. Trump has lost his bid for a second term. The U.S. state of Georgia has completed a manual recount of all the ballots cast there in the presidential election.
Like other Republicans, I'm disappointed our candidate didn't win Georgia's electoral votes. Close elections sow distrust. People feel their side was cheated. We saw this from the Democrats in 2018, and we see this from Republicans today. Working as an engineer throughout my life, I lived by the motto that numbers don't lie. As Secretary of State, I believe that the numbers that we have presented today are correct. The numbers reflect the verdict of the people, not a decision by the Secretary of State's office or of courts or of either campaigns. The audit revealed that in some counties, not all the votes have been counted. That doesn't mean those counties had systemic problems, but it does raise a concern. We must implement a reconciliation process that prevents such errors from happening in the future.
That could have been Mickey Mouse. That could have been a dead person. The recount being done in Georgia will tell us nothing, because these fraudulent ballots will just be counted again because they wouldn't supply the signatures to match. the ballots. So it means nothing. It would suggest that there was a plan from a centralized place to execute these various acts of voter fraud, specifically focused on big cities, and specifically focused on, as you would imagine, big cities controlled by Democrats. We cannot not allow these crooks, because that's what they are, to steal an election from the American people. They elected Donald Trump. They didn't elect Joe Biden. Joe Biden is in the lead because of the fraudulent ballots.
Meanwhile, Twitter will hand control of the presidential @POTUS account to Joe Biden when he is sworn in on the inauguration day, even if President Trump has not conceded his election loss, according to U.S. media. The social media giant is actively preparing to support the transition of the White House institutional Twitter accounts on January 20th, 2021. Twitter spokesperson Nick Pasilio told Politico in an email. He also said the process is being done in consultation with the National Archives, as it was in 2017. The handover will see all existing tweets on @POTUS as well as @FLOTUS, @VP, and other official accounts archived. The accounts will then be reset to 0 tweets and transferred to the incoming Biden White House that day. Although a number of media outlets have dubbed Mr. Biden the informal victor based on his current standing in the Electoral College, garnering 36 more votes than the 270 needed to win, Twitter's announcement comes before any winner has been officially declared. President Trump continues to assert the election was stolen from him through widespread voter fraud.
Pfizer confirmed Friday that it and partner BioNTech have applied for emergency use authorization for their coronavirus vaccine, becoming the first to do so in the U.S. or Europe as the pandemic rages around the world. The vaccine has been developed with breathtaking speed just 10 months after the genetic code of the novel coronavirus was first sequenced. Watch this.
It is with great pride and joy, and even a little relief. But I can say that our request for emergency use authorization for our COVID-19 vaccine is now in the FDA's hands. It took just 248 days to get from the day we announced our plans to collaborate with BioNTech to our FDA submission date. Today, we were able to submit a very robust data set that we believe meets and in many cases exceeds the FDA's high standards.
The Food and Drug Administration has not said how long it will take to study the vaccine data, but the government expects to give the green light for the vaccine in the first 2 weeks of December. The European Union could also move quickly on the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, perhaps as soon as the second half of December, according to European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen.
Now, the speed with which these vaccines have been developed as the pandemic wreaks havoc around the world has no precedent. Over the past decade, the vaccines authorized in the U.S. have taken an average of 8 years to develop. The U.S. government said it plans to vaccinate more than 20 million people in December and then another 25 to 30 million per month, adding to the encouraging 95% efficiency data for the Pfizer product is the fact that efficacy was found to be consistent across all age groups, a primary concern for a disease that hits the elderly the hardest, as well as genders and ethnicities. Pfizer and BioNTech says 170 people fell sick in an ongoing clinical trial of almost 44,000 people, 162 of whom were in a placebo group and 8 of whom received a 2-dose medicine. Now, both vaccines use mRNA messenger or messenger ribonucleic acid technology to deliver genetic material to the body that makes human cells create a protein from the virus. Now, this trains the immune system to be ready to attack if it encounters SARS-CoV-2. Here's Dr. Virginia Pitzer, an associate professor of epidemiology at Yale School of Public Health.
I think it's very promising. I think coming on the heels of the Pfizer announcement last week, it wasn't entirely unexpected given they are based on a very kind of similar technology. But it's always, I think, incredibly encouraging to see the results from the Pfizer vaccine backed up by the additional results from the Moderna vaccine trial. And ultimately, I think by seeing these early efficacy results, the hope is that the vaccine could be made available on an earlier basis based on these somewhat preliminary findings. The fact that it requires 2 vaccinations certainly is a challenge, and part of that is communicating to individuals that after they receive the first dose, that's not the end of it. They need to come back 3 to 4 weeks later, depending on the vaccine, to receive a second dose. I think there will also be logistical challenges in terms of keeping track of which vaccine individuals received.
There are important differences between the 2 vaccines. Pfizer's needs to be stored at minus 70 degrees Celsius, while Moderna's only needs minus 20 degrees Celsius, more akin to a regular freezer. Take a look.
One of the challenges that was seen with the Pfizer vaccine was this requirement for minus 80 degrees Celsius storage, which only kind of certain research, mostly facilities, would have that type of storage for the vaccine available. Whereas with the Moderna vaccine, the cold chain requirements or the requirements for keeping the vaccine at the proper temperature are much more in line with the freezers that are available kind of in a typical healthcare setting. So in order to convince people to get the vaccine, I think, it's important to demonstrate that these vaccines are not only effective, and the fact that it is very effective goes a long way to doing that, but also demonstrating that they're safe, which all of the signs up till now in the trials do suggest that they are also very safe to receive.
On the other hand, the Pfizer-BioNTech doses are much smaller, 30 micrograms to Moderna's NIH's 100 micrograms, probably lowering production costs per dose.
People line up at the LAX airport in Los Angeles on Friday, despite the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention asking Americans not to travel for Thanksgiving holiday next week due to surging coronavirus cases. Watch this.
Needed to get away, needed to just kind of get back to a little bit of normalcy for us. We travel a lot, and this is the first trip that we've taken all year.
Not really. We just follow all the rules, and I travel for work all the time.
It's a matter of staying safe and wearing your mask, keeping your distance.
Social distance as much as you can, wash your hands, and that's it. People have to live their lives.
Thanksgiving is the busiest U.S. holiday in terms of travel, as it falls on a Thursday and many Americans take the Friday off work and make a long weekend of it. America was hit by a spike of over 200,000 new infections and 2,239 fatalities, the worst death toll since May over the past 24 hours, according to a running tally by Johns Hopkins University.
The impacts of COVID-19 could have dire long-term consequences on children as the pandemic drags on. That is the warning from UN Children's Fund, or UNICEF, which has unveiled research showing that while symptoms among youngsters infected with COVID-19 are mostly mild, the impact on their education, nutrition, and well-being could be life-altering. Henrietta Fore, UNICEF Executive Director, rejected the myth that children are barely affected affected by the disease. Nothing could be further from the truth, she said, noting that disruptions to key services and soaring poverty rates caused by the pandemic were the biggest threats to a whole generation. Although children can transmit the virus, the UN agency said that they're storing evidence that the net benefits of keeping schools open outweigh the costs of closing them. Schools are not a main driver of community transmission, and children are more likely to get the virus outside school settings, UNICEF maintained. Based on data gathered from 87 countries, children and teens accounted for 1 in 9 COVID infections, according to the UN agency's report, averting a lost COVID generation.
U.S. President Donald Trump's eldest son, Donald Trump Jr., has tested positive for COVID-19 and is quarantining without symptoms, the latest in a long list of infections among those with links to the White House. His spokesman said he is completely asymptomatic so far and is following all medical recommended COVID-19 guidelines. A businessman and father of 5, Trump Jr. has been actively supporting his father's legal battle against what the Trump campaign argues was a widespread fraud that cost him the U.S. presidential election's victory. Trump Jr.'s positive test follows infections for a string of others connected to the White House, including his father, who was hospitalized, the president's wife, Melania, and Trump's youngest son, Barron. Donald Jr.'s girlfriend, former Fox News host Kimberly Guilfoyle, also tested positive in July.
Eagle News will be right back. Stay tuned.
Mula noon hanggang ngayon, gabay natin ang MTRCB ratings sa matalino at responsableng panonood. Sa tamang pagsunod sa MTRCB ratings, ginagawa nating ligtas at makabuluhan ang panonood ng bawat miyembro ng pamilyang Pilipino. Lumipas man ang panahon, hanggang may pamilyang Pilipino, andyan ang MTRCB.
Welcome back. 8 people were injured in a shooting at a U.S. mall in Wisconsin on Friday, according to police, who said they were still hunting for the shooter. The FBI and the Milwaukee County Sheriff's Office tweeted that their officers were on the scene at the Mayfair Mall in Wauwatosa, Wisconsin, supporting the active response by local police. Let's listen in.
On this date, approximately 2:50 p.m., our dispatchers received some 911 calls reporting a shooting incident at the mall near the northwest entrance to Macy's. Wauwatosa police officers and Wauwatosa Fire Department personnel responded. When emergency personnel arrived, the shooter was no longer at the scene. 7 injured adults and 1 injured teenager were transported to the hospital by Wauwatosa Fire Department. The extent of their injuries is unknown at this time. Everybody was alive at that time, though, so there's not been any fatalities that I'm aware of. Preliminary statements from witnesses indicate that the shooter is a white male in his 20s or 30s. Investigators are working on determining the identity of that suspect. Any information reporting the shooter's identity at this time is false.
Numerous workers at the mall took shelter inside the building as the shooter rampaged, according to video circulating on social media. Wauwatosa Mayor Dennis McBride confirmed there were multiple victims, but said that none of their injuries appeared to be life-threatening. The FBI is assisting in the investigation.
At least 3 people were killed Saturday when a barrage of rockets struck densely populated parts of Kabul, officials said, marking the latest attack in an ongoing wave of violence sweeping the Afghan capital. The salvo slammed into various parts of central and north Kabul, including near the heavily fortified Green Zone that houses embassies and international companies just before 9 a.m. No group immediately claimed the blasts, and the Taliban denied responsibility. Recent big attacks in Kabul, including 2 horrific assaults on educational institutions that killed nearly 50 people in recent weeks, follow a familiar pattern in the aftermath, with the Taliban denying any involvement while the Afghan government pins the blame on them or their proxies. The Taliban are under pressure not to attack urban areas, having pledged not to do so under the terms of a U.S. withdrawal deal signed in February. Any acknowledgement of overt involvement in such incidents could, in theory, slow down or slow the American pullout, though outgoing U.S. President Donald Trump has made clear that he wants U.S. forces out regardless of the situation on the ground.
The death of a black man beaten by white security guards at a supermarket sparked protests across Brazil as the country celebrated Black Consciousness Day. The video on social media shows 40-year-old welder João Alberto Silveira Freitas repeatedly being punched in the face and head by a security guard while he's being restrained by another at the supermarket. A woman stands beside them, filming with her mobile phone. The military police in Rio Grande do Sul state said that the man had threatened a female worker at the supermarket who called security. Silveira Freitas lost consciousness during the assault and died on the spot as medics tried to revive him. A friend of the victim who witnessed the beating told G1 News that as the security guards were hitting him, Silveira Freitas screamed that he could not breathe. A scene reminiscent of the death of George Floyd, a black man who suffocated beneath the knee of a white U.S. police in Minneapolis last May. As the clip went viral, around 1,000 protesters in Sao Paulo marched to a branch of the French-owned Carrefour supermarket chain and stoned the glass storefront before storming the premises. Police in Porto Alegre, meanwhile, used tear gas and flashbang grenades to disperse a protest that had formed in front of the supermarket where the death occurred, according to local television. Protests also broke out in the capital Brasilia, Belo Horizonte, and Rio de Janeiro.
The number of injuries attributed to Typhoon Ulysses, which slammed across a large area of Luzon, has climbed to 68. The National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council said in its Saturday update. This is higher than the 24 reported in Friday's update. The number of deaths remained at 73 and 19 people were still missing. The deaths, injured, and missing were recorded in Cagayan Valley, Central Luzon, Calabarzon, the Bicol area, and the Cordillera regions and the National Capital Region. Meanwhile, affected families were placed at 912,912, which is equivalent to 3,747,201 persons residing in 6,197 barangays in Ilocos, Cagayan Valley, Central Luzon, Calabarzon, Mimaropa, Bicol, NCR, and the Cordillera region. Damage to agriculture was placed at 4,213,681,074 incurred in Ilocos, Cagayan Valley, Central Luzon, Calabarzon, Bicol, Cordillera, and the NCR. Damage to infrastructure was estimated at 8,699,732,576 in Ilocos, Cagayan Valley, Central Luzon, Calabarzon, Mimaropa, Bicol, Cordillera, and the NCR.
Meanwhile, a mayor in the typhoon-ravaged Cagayan Valley region told an online media agency to be responsible in their reports. In her Facebook post on November 14, Alcala Town Mayor lawyer Cristina Antonio called out Rappler for its irresponsible coverage of the calamity that hit their region, saying undermining the efforts of the hardworking volunteers. Attorney Antonio said, please be responsible in reporting. Do not add to the fear and hysteria, and you are doing the good and brave men and women rescuers of Alcala a great disservice. They've been working nonstop, round the clock, for the past 4 days. They do not deserve this. Be responsible. As of this writing, the mayor's Facebook post has gathered 4.2 thousand reactions, 490 comments, and 4,401 shares from Facebook users. She implied to be frustrated as she asked the online news site to provide context and complete details in the post that Rappler grabbed from her page. Rescuers are unable to continue rescue efforts at night because this would put their lives and the people they tried to rescue in more grave danger, she said. She also said that the rescuers need to halt their operations come nighttime due to danger. She also said that they would not be able to see anything. The water is still rising. Water current is strong and unpredictable. Tree trunks and other debris are swirling in the water, and there are electric power lines along the way that may cause accidents. How could rescuers rescue if they themselves become victims? Worse, she said, rescuers and the evacuees they try to rescue may perish under these perilous circumstances at night. It can also be assumed that these Rappler postings, she said, made it appear that the government was late in conducting its operations. It was the 4th day our rescuers have been going out to bring our evacuees to safety. Please do not make it appear in the caption that it's only now that rescue efforts are being launched, she said, adding that Alcala Town is 1.5 hours away from Tuguegarao.
An American jailed in 1985 for spying for Israel was released from strict parole conditions on Friday, allowing him to move to Israel, the U.S. Justice Department said. Jonathan Pollard served 30 years for giving away classified U.S. documents and had been confined by parole terms to the United States since his release in 2015, despite Israeli pressure to allow him to leave. Pollard, who is Jewish, was a U.S. Navy intelligence analyst in the mid-1980s when he made contact with an Israeli colonel in New York and began sending U.S. secrets to Israel in exchange for tens of thousands of dollars. Israel, where he is regarded as a hero and which awarded him citizenship in 1995, repeatedly pressured Washington for the release of Pollard, making it one of the top issues for or of bilateral relations. Some of the material stolen by Pollard ended up in the Soviet Union, including information on U.S. informants.
The UN Refugee Agency warned today that fighting in northern Ethiopia could create 200,000 refugees in the next 6 months. Take a look.
Set up providing food and other assistance.
Here at Hamdayat border point in Sudanese on the Ethiopian border, every day thousands of Ethiopian refugees flee to Sudan. The situation is very dire and people need safe drinking water, they need food, they need shelter, they need sanitation, they need medical care and other help. UNHCR and partners are here to help. We now need the help urgently of donors to support this operation so that we can make a difference in saving lives for Ethiopian refugees in Sudan.
We're at the Hamdayat.
Ethiopia's military is battling rebel forces. Ethiopia's military is battling rebel forces in the Tigray region, and hundreds of people have been killed. UNICEF said the outbreak of conflict in Ethiopia's Tigray region has left some 2.3 million children in urgent need of assistance, and thousands more are at risk in refugee camps. Neighboring Sudan itself, suffering from a severe economic crisis, was caught off guard when the conflict broke out earlier this month. At least 32,000 refugees have already fled to Sudan.
So here we have the registration.
South African police fired tear gas and water cannons at economic freedom fighters or EFF supporters protesting against alleged racism at Brackenfell, a Cape Town school where a whites-only year-end party was allegedly held earlier in October 2020. Watch this.
So here's the message to all the white people of South Africa. Every time the EFF is in confrontation with the racists, if you choose the side of the racists, you must know that you are no longer ordinary white people, you are racists, and we're going to attend to you.
So we condemn the EFF calling for the murder of people. Just here today, I don't even know how the EFF got this license. How did the judge approve the license for the EFF that has openly said they're coming to cause unrest, to cause damage, and to harm people?
The protests were the latest in a string of demonstrations against alleged racism at Brackenfell High School following the dance party held in late October. A few days after the party, EFF members tried to march to the school but were blocked by some of the students' parents, resulting in fistfights. Widely shared video footage showed dramatic scenes of angry white people punching EFF's black protesters on the streets on November 9. President Cyril Ramaphosa called for an investigation, describing the clashes as deeply regrettable. Despite the end of apartheid a generation ago, racial tensions in South Africa often remain high.
And rescue workers are digging through mounds of thick mud Thursday in a grim search for bodies as Central American countries began to count the cost of Hurricane Iota, which left at least 44 people dead amid a wave of destruction. Initial estimates by the UN Children's Fund, UNICEF, put the number of people affected by the hurricane at 4.6 million across the impoverished region, including 1.8 million children. Among the worst-hit areas was the Penas de Blanca Mountains in the Matagalpa department of northern Nicaragua, where rescue workers dug desperately through mudfalls in the search for more victims. A landslide on Tuesday also claimed the lives of 9 people, 6 of them children, but more are missing. Iota made landfall in northwestern Nicaragua on Monday as a giant Category 5 hurricane, the year's biggest Atlantic storm.
We have more news for you. Please don't go away.
Events happen around us all the time, in our community, in our country, around the world. Events that affect people, move communities, or simply inspire us. Interesting events that people need to know. In these interesting times, we continue to be a competent partner in delivering news about these events. Fast, accurate, balanced, eagle news, because we live in interesting times.
Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, or BSP's inflation targeting framework, provides monetary authorities the flexibility on its policy stance, which is aimed to ensure price stability that is beneficial to sustainable growth and employment. In a virtual briefing, BSP Governor Benjamin Diokno said the health crisis had required central banks to be nimble as the pandemic differed from other crises because it had a solid and fast influence on domestic and global demand. Watch this.
Reflecting slower domestic economic activity, lower global crude oil prices, and the recent appreciation of the peso. The balance of risk to the inflation outlook also remains tilted toward the downside, owing largely to potential disruptions to domestic and global economic activity amid the ongoing pandemic. Meanwhile, uncertainty remains elevated amid the resurgence of COVID-19 cases globally. However, the Monetary Board also observed that global economic prospects have moderated in recent weeks. At the same time, the Monetary Board noted that while domestic output contracted at a slower pace in the third quarter of 2020, muted business and household sentiment and the impact of recent natural calamities could pose strong headwinds to the recovery of the economy in the coming months. Given these considerations, the Monetary Board sees enough policy space for a reduction in the policy rate at this time to uplift market sentiment and nurture the country's economic recovery amid increased downside risk to growth. Looking ahead, the BSP stands ready to deploy full arsenal of instruments as needed in fulfillment of its mandate to maintain price and financial stability conducive to sustainable economic growth.
Meanwhile, ahead of the G20 Riyadh Summit, Secretary General Antonio Guterres issued an SOS for the needs of developing countries for COVID-19 recovery as they face the precipice of financial ruin and escalating poverty, hunger, and untold suffering. The UN chief said the recent breakthroughs on COVID-19 vaccines offer a ray of hope, but that ray of hope needs to reach everyone. Take a look.
Across the board, I'm issuing an SOS for the needs of developing countries. Since day one, I've pushed for a massive rescue package equivalent to at least 10% of the global economy. Developed countries can afford to provide enormous relief for their own societies, and they are doing so. But the developing world is on the precipice of financial ruin and escalating poverty, hunger, and untold suffering. The recent breakthroughs on COVID-19 vaccines offer a ray of hope. But that ray of hope needs to reach everyone. That means ensuring that vaccines are treated as a global public good, accessible and affordable to everyone, everywhere. A people's vaccine. This is not a do-good exercise. It is the only way to stop the pandemic dead in its tracks. The trillions of dollars being spent for COVID recovery is money that we are borrowing from future generations, every last penny. And we cannot use those resources to lock in policies that burden them with a mountain of debt on a broken and dangerous planet.
The EU hopes the U.S. will adopt a more multilateralist stance when President-elect Joe Biden takes power, the bloc's chief says on the eve of a G20 summit. Let's listen in.
We also expect, of course, new momentum from the new U.S. administration on this issue, thanks to the President-elect's declaration that the U.S. would join the Paris Agreement once again. Last year, at G20, the US broke the consensus in view of their opposition to the Paris Agreement. This year, I'm happy to see that US are supporting the conclusions. At the summit, I will once again urge G20 partners to commit to the full and effective implementation of the Paris Agreement. We've made progress.
Europe has welcomed the election this month of Biden as the next U.S. president. Trump has not conceded and has launched a legal and media blitz to support his unsubstantiated claim that voter fraud occurred. He remains the U.S. leader until January 20 next year.
China live streamed footage of its new manned submersible parked at the bottom of the ocean on Friday, the latest foray by the country's scientists into the Earth's deepest ocean trench. Take a look. The vessel Fenduche or Striver descended more than 10,000 meters into the Pacific Ocean's Mariana Trench with 3 researchers on board, according to state broadcaster CCTV. Now, the video footage shot and relayed by a deep-sea camera showed the green and white submersible moving through dark waters surrounded by clouds of debris as it slowly touched down on the seabed. Now, the submersible had earlier this month set a national record of 10,909 meters for manned deep-sea diving, just shy of the 10,927-meter world record set by an American explorer in 2019. The submersible, equipped with robotic arms to collect biological samples and sonar eyes that use sound waves to identify surrounding objects, is making repeated dives to test its capabilities.
A new augmented reality app gives visitors a glimpse of what Hong Kong looked like over 100 years ago, all while soaking in the views of the Victoria Harbour on a Ferris wheel. Watch this.
Sure. Well, usually AR uses plane tracking or surface tracking in order to position or lock the 3D models into a space, right? But with this, we had to make sure that while the camera is moving, that information would lock and stay in the exact same space as the gondola moves around. So that's really the challenge, and that's why it's one of the first apps that's ever done it before.
We tried to also be very, very true to the history. We worked with the historians, Jason Wordy and Ko Tim Kung, to help us validate and authenticate all the information we had in there. So everything that you see is really real to those periods. So we've done it. We've peeled back the history, and you can experience what it looked like from hovering above the middle of the harbour back in the 1890s and the 1960s, and that really, really was amazing.
The app is launched by Hong Kong Observation Wheel, a 60-meter tall Ferris wheel sitting on the harbour front of the city's bustling central business district. After downloading the app into their smartphone, visitors can compare the skyscrapers-filled landscape at the present with the views of the harbour back in the 1890s or the 1960s. Local historian Ko Tim Kung, who worked with the operators in the project, said the periods were chosen because both were important eras to Hong Kong's history when rapid development radically changed the cityscape.
And in other news, OFWs hit by the recent pandemic received food and essentials at the Philippine Embassy in Bahrain. Lorlene Kalimlim reports from Bahrain.
We are here at the Philippine Embassy here in Manama, Kingdom of Bahrain, where members of the Iglesia ni Cristo, or Church of Christ, are aiding their fellow countrymen as part of their worldwide humanitarian program. In spite of the threat of the COVID-19 pandemic, members of the Iglesia ni Cristo continue to uphold their advocacy of helping others in different parts of the world. Here in Bahrain, members have distributed luggages, clothes, feminine kits, and milk to distressed OFWs and their children at the OWA Care Center. This is made possible in coordination with the Philippine Ambassador to the Kingdom, His Excellency Alfonso A. Ver.
Magandang umaga po sa inyo. Una po sa lahat, on behalf of the Embassy and all the wards at the Embassy Shelter, gusto ko lang ho magpasalamat sa Iglesia ni Cristo sa inyong patuloy at natatanging pagtulong sa ating mga kababayan na nangangailangan. Lalo na po sa panahon ng pandemya na tuloy pa rin ang inyong pagtulong kahit may pandemya. Wala ho tayong takot at buti na lang din po nandito tayo sa Bahrain at mas alaga rin tayo dito. Pagpapagamot, sa pagtetest at may mga Pilipino po dito na tinamaan na po at meron na rin pong mga nasawi. Pero sa lahat-lahat pa rin po, safe pa rin po tayo dito at nagbubukas na rin ang economy at sana po makapagbalik na sa trabaho ang ating mga kababayan at tuloy na rin ang kanilang pamumuhay, tuloy na rin ang kanilang pagsuporta sa kanilang pamilya, na malusog sila at masaya at kahit paano back to normal, no? Kahit ibang-iba na po dito sa pandemya. So, as a last note, I'd just like to take this opportunity once again. I recall the fond memories, the visit of Executive Minister Eduardo V. Manalo last year. It was an honor and privilege for us, for the Filipinos here, to welcome him and for the immense project and that he did here. And we will always remember that. And today, now a year later, even with the COVID pandemic, the same fire and intensity of helping our fellow men is still there. And that we look forward when we go back to normal times. So we hope that he could come back and join us again here in the Kingdom of Bahrain. Maraming salamat po sa inyo lahat.
Magandang araw po. Narito kami ngayon sa bulwagan ng pasuguan ng Pilipinas dito sa bansang Bahrain upang isagawa ang Aid to Humanity bilang paggunita sa kaarawan ng ating tagapamahalang pangkalahatan, ang kapatid ni Eduardo B. Manalo. At nagpapasalamat po tayo dahil ang ating butihing ambasador ay nakasama natin ngayon upang maisagawa ang isang banal na layunin ng Iglesia ni Cristo na tumulong sa ating mga kababayan, lalo na sa mga nangangailangan ng tulong katulad nito. Dapat ay sagawan natin ng napakalaking paglingap dito, pero dahil sa sinusunod po na health protocol ng gobyerno ay limitado lang po. Subalit, nagpapasalamat po tayo dahil natupad natin ang isang layunin na pinakahangad ng Iglesia ni Cristo na makatulong tayo sa ating kababayan. Muli, happy birthday po, Sir, kay Eduardo B. Manalo. At asahan po ninyo na lagi nyo kaming kaisa sa lahat ng inyong layunin. At mula po dito sa bansang Bahrain, ay nagpapasalamat po kami ng marami at happy birthday po ulit. Salamat po.
Ako po si Miriam Halibas, galing po ako Mindanao. Wala po akong masyadong karanasan sa COVID kasi hindi po ako nakakalabas. At andito po ako sa embassy kasi po 2 taon akong nagtatrabaho dito, finish contract po ako at nakulong po ako dahil inakusahan ako ng amo ko na nagnakaw, but I was vindicated. So andito po ako ngayon sa embassy. At saka so far, hinihintay ko na lang po yung resulta ng attorney ko para po makauwi ako. At itong tulong po na natanggap namin galing sa iglesia ay malaking tulong po sa lahat ng ward at sa lahat ng Pilipino na distress na andito ngayon sa embassy. Malaking tulong po kasi sa kawalan at saka sila po yung inspirasyon namin para bumangon ulit at makauwi sa pamilya namin ng kumpleto na wala na pong dinadaing na problema.
Ang pagtulong po sa mga nangangailangan at ang programang Aid to Humanity sa pangunguna po ng tagapamahalang pangkalahatan, ang kapatid na Eduardo V. Manalo, ay ginagawa po ng buong Iglesia ni Cristo sa buong mundo para po hindi lamang po maibigay sa kanila ang kanilang mga pangunahing pangangailangan, kundi mapalakas din po ang kanilang espiritual na pamumuhay. Kaya po ngayon po sa pagse-celebrate ng birthday po ng tagapamahalang pangkalahatan ay ipinasya po ng Iglesia ni Cristo na gawin po ang pagtulong pong ito sa mga mamamayan na nasa ibang bansa para po mapalakas ang kanilang loob at maipakilala sa kanila ang Iglesia ni Cristo at ang kahalagahan po ng salita ng ating Panginoon Diyos.
Whenever anybody needs help, the spirit of gift-giving will be very evident. And whichever part of the world you may be, the Filipino teamwork will always be recognizable. This is Lorlin Kalimlim, your Eagle News correspondent from Bahrain, and we live in interesting times.
Thank you, Lorlin.
That's it for tonight's broadcast. Thank you so much for joining us. I am CJ Hero. Join us again on Monday.
And at the end of the day, there remains so much more to be grateful for. I'm Alma Angeles, and we live in interesting times.
Shoutout sa lahat ng mga nasa kanilang mga bahay, mga timbahay natin dyan. Yeah. Yo. COVID-19 ka lang. Yo, paano ba dapat iwasan? Ace Gut Beats nga pala, Ace Guts.
Ace Guts on the beat.
Masyado ka na bang natatakot, nagugulumihanan sa mga napapanood mo? Kakilakilabot na balita na kamamatay na virus, dulutay, pagkalito. Kakabaka-baka kahit sa loob ka ng bahay, baka kamadapuan. Parang baka pa sa pamilihan yung mga kailangan, baka ka maubusan. Pahabol-habol, sino may alkohol, baka may maskatol sa may bandaron. May bumibili pa nga ng 2 kahon, nilalabo nata nila hasta mo katol. Gusto ko namang hamon, kailan magkakaroon. Imbis na mataranta, pati maghinahon. Magdiwangan magsalo-salo sa ganitong sitwasyon. Manatili ka sa bahay, mas ligtas ka ron. Sumunod sa alituntunin dahil ang magsisi, lagi na sa dulo. Minsan ang kapahamakan, wala sa virus, kundi sa katigasan ng ulo. Walang turuan, dapat ang tulungan, dahil yun ang pinakamaigi. Hugas kamay sa lababo, hindi sa paninisi, habaan ng pisi. Basahin mo mabuti, nakita mo balita, bago mo ikalat, dapat manigurado. Pag hindi ka naging responsable, magigimit siya ng bagong pagtatalo. Sumulan mo sa'yo ang pagbabago, pangako sa'yo may mababago. Kapag ang tama, minamasama, iba ka nalang layunin, hindi yung mga tao. Basta sumunod ka, kumonsulta, saka mong pumunta, dapat nga malugod ka. Dahil may mga taong handang ialik at ilang buhay para hindi ka madapuan ng sakit. Wala yung kapalit upang yumakapit di ka sa buhay dito sa kalagitnaan ng panahon ng krisis, hindi dapat ibinawaglit. Saludo sa mga frontline ng ating bayan. Di lang sila, lahat tayo ay may kinalaman. Huwag mo hayaang malantakan na parang halaman. Dinagad mo ang iyong sarili ng kaalaman. Wala munang hahawak ng bola, beso-beso kay lolo't lola. Baka hindi lang paggalang ang maipasa mo, coronavirus. Iwan sa labas ang nice shoes, ibis na magchichirya, right foot, veg and fruits. At kapag nasunod mo ng lahat, ikaw pa'y alanganin. Alanganin ng kontrol, idaan mo na sa panalangin. Nakarami mang napapahamak, tandaan mong di ka dapat na matakot. Dapat sumunod ka sa kanyang utos, sa dakilang manggagamot.
This is Net 25, a commercial UHF television station owned and operated by the Eagle Broadcasting Corporation. Transmitting on a 50 kilowatt output with NTC permit number BSD-0184-2020 REN, authorizing this station to operate until July 12, 2023. Net 25 studios and transmitter are located at number 25 Central Avenue, New Era, Quezon City. Net 25 is headed by the following personnel duly licensed by the Professional Regulations Commission and the National Telecommunications Commission. Engineer Armando C. Bonifacio Jr., PECE number 838. Engineer Bernard N. Pangulayan, PECE number 869. Engineer Randy A. Velasco, PECE number 555, with first-class radio telephone operators, Modesto V. De Vera, 96-1 PNCR-18494, Fred C. Moliena, 93-1 PVI-6551, Crisostomo G. Narvaez Jr., 96-1 PII-17628. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Net 25 signing off.
Bayang magiliw, perlas ng silanganan, alam ng puso, sa titik mo'y buhay.